Oh shoot, I need to make sure to mute the video. And now that's gonna wind up in the video.
Good start.
Yeah, capital professionalism. Hello everyone, I'm Leo Damascus. This is Arthur Gemini. And we get to start.
Oh, I get to start.
Yeah, you get to start.
Let me actually. Okay, there we go. All right, so today's theme is horror games.
We actually stuck with it.
Yeah. Well, we said we would, and therefore we are. And so, I think the best first topic we can start with is what makes a horror game. Do you have any opinions on this one?
What exactly makes a horror game?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a pretty broad question, but with a very obvious answer, and that's just a scary game. It's just a game that has to be scary.
Yeah. I mean, I can agree with that. I feel this is a question we kind of needed to start with.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for the most part, a horror game is something that's kind of got to crawl under your skin. And it's got to kind of just off-put you as much as possible.
What exactly do you mean by I guess off-put you or put you off?
Basically, you've got to sort of feel uncomfortable. I don't think it's necessarily about being scared because there's something horrifying, so much as the fact that you simply don't want to progress because you're afraid of what's coming next.
Okay. But we probably would need to distinguish a little bit if we're trying to define it that way, though, because you have like those anime girl shooter game things. Those are sure gonna make you uncomfortable. The same thing with Hatoful Boyfriend, but those clearly aren't horror games.
Hatoful Boyfriend, I heard, is a very good game.
But not a horror game.
And I think the thing with horror is like okay, with Hatoful Boyfriend, you feel uncomfortable, but you're not really afraid to progress because you're like in fear so much as you're just kind of reluctant to deal with what's coming next. No, I think another big thing with a horror game is the fact that a horror game's main theme is overcoming fear. Because see, Hatoful Boyfriend, at no point are you really like, man, I've just got to overcome the difficulties, like all the emotions that make me not want to progress. Compare that to even the classic Silent Hill games, and one of the main premises or themes of the game was pretty much, you don't want to progress because there's horrifying things. You don't want to deal with it, and you don't want to move on. But being a horror game, your goal is to progress and overcome that fear.
So mostly it sounds like you're saying that it's thematic.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Okay. So on to our next focus. We wanted to talk about graphics in horror games especially. And how does that fit into the whole thematic kind of thing?
I'd say graphics is probably one of the more important things in a horror game. And the reason being is, it's not so much good graphics matter. Good graphics help, but they aren't. It's not so much the fact that the good graphics are the most important, so much as graphics in general they set up the tone, the mood, and any visual themes. They our eyes are generally what give us a lot of processing information, especially in video games where we lack a lot of our other senses. So the graphics really need to match up with what the goal of the game is.
So do you think a game has to have good graphics in order to be scary?
I don't say they need to have good graphics. I mean, I'd say good animations are important, because some old games, they have some really brutal scenes that just kind of come off as derpy because of just how silly the characters look going through these actions. I'll get to one example of that. Yeah, actually, I'll bring it up now. I mentioned Silent Hill being classic horror game, and I think this is actually one of the games that has this problem. In Silent Hill 2, one of the bosses you fight is two pyramid heads, one of the iconic enemies of the franchise. And for the most part, when you finally win that fight, basically the pyramid heads end up like putting their spears or whatever into the ground, or the weapons into the ground, with the blades pointing outwards, and then they just sort of like jab their heads onto it, like they impale themselves on their weapons. But when they die, they do that ridiculous civilian T pose, and so you've just got two dead guys just standing like this. And it's hard to take a scene seriously when the enemies that you're when like the big threat just looks so goofy when he's dead.
It's kind of odd, though. You bring up goofiness a little bit, and I remember hearing about the creative process behind Five Nights at Freddy's, for example. That game actually started off, the guy who was making it, Scott Cawson, made a game about a bunch of beavers running a logging company, and it was like this friendly little kids games, but he messed up on the graphics of these beavers, and everybody kept on commenting on it, saying that they looked like these horrible monstrosities. And at that point he was about ready to give up on gaming, but he decided, inspiration struck him, and he said, I bet I can make something that will really scare them instead of just these beaver things. And that story just, it seems to highlight the difference, because he's taking these same kind of graphics and putting them into a horror context, and suddenly it becomes this big, booming sensation. Like you know how big Five Nights at Freddy's has become.
Yeah, it got the internet by storm. Nobody was expecting it.
Yeah, and that's coming using graphics from a game that just couldn't take off because of its graphics.
Yeah. Also, gonna address what Whizbox said, and I'd agree that audio is pretty important, and I do think you kind of have to have a combination, because even the most eerie of music in like one of those wonderful planes is probably not going to really fit so well. On the flip side, even the darkest corridor is not going to be so spooky if all you hear is, do you believe in magic?
I would love to see a horror game actually try to pull that off, though. Depending on how you use it, maybe you could do that.
It'd be interesting. I mean, you could probably do both. I mean, you just sort of make yourself seem insane by playing happy music in dark times. Bioshock Infinite arguably does quite a bit of that, actually. And on the flip side, I think there's actually some games that play some dreary music during happy times. And it actually works out really well. Also, a friend of mine really, really found it amusing that I made a "Do you believe in magic" reference. But I thought I'd share that with you. But I think the thing with audio is nobody would ever argue that audio is important. Like, everybody just pretty much says that good horror requires good sounds. But a lot of people insist. Actually, I think a reason that graphics are an interesting topic to bring up is Jim Sterling actually said that horror games are better ugly, because if they're beautiful, it takes away from the horror. And I kind of disagree with that a bit, just because I kind of wish I remembered his whole argument exactly. Kind of hard to refute an argument that you don't really remember. But I do think for the most part, ugly graphic or not beautiful graphics can work to your favor. I do think that actually lends itself really well to the first Dark Souls game. It was really, really gritty, and not just like a thematic way, but just graphically. It was a PlayStation 3 game that looked like a PlayStation 2 game. But that worked really well for the game's environments. On the flip side, Alien Isolation is gorgeous, and I think its graphics actually kind of fit really well. Like, I don't know if Alien Isolation would really work so well looking like something that came out on the PS2, or heaven forbid, the PlayStation X. The original one. Good job, Sony.
By the way, top 30 in Zombies Bow 2, You were asking if there's a Five Nights at Freddy's 4? Yes, there is. It came out just as we were planning this episode, actually.
Yeah, I actually believe we said that we were going to talk about it at least briefly, or at least Five Nights at Freddy's because of it.
Mm. Yeah, and Five Nights at Freddy's is kind of an interesting game. I already talked about the graphics in that game. What else did we want to talk about?
I think we wanted to talk about some other things, but I believe we want to put them off until later for thematic reasons.
Mm.
And speaking of thematic reasons, let's go on to the next theme. Does the horror genre limit the gameplay formats?
Does it limit the gameplay formats?
Basically, does a horror genre or horror game have to play in a specific way? Does a horror game have to be like Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Dead Space, Alien Isolation? Even Amnesia is a first-person game. I mean, as Cookie said, limiting player actions. And I'm going to go with no, because most of those games don't really play the same way. Resident Evil has the oh-so-delightful tank controls that everybody didn't love from the PlayStation 2 era. Alien Isolation, great controls. It also focuses a lot more on hiding and crafting, while Resident Evil focused a lot more on shooting zombies and solving some puzzles. Actually, they both rely on puzzles. There was actually an NES game that a lot of people like to regard as a good horror game. Sweet Home. It is a Japanese RPG, and it's interesting as a horror game because that's not a genre you'd expect from a horror game.
No, RPG is just so incredibly slow-paced, and usually when people are talking about horror, they're talking about the jump scares and
Yeah.
all of these kinds of monsters chasing you down, and you can't chase very well in a turn-based kind of environment.
That said, I do think Sweet Home actually kind of hits a lot on what a horror game can be. Because even with its graphics are pretty good for an NES game, but its soundtrack is straight up atrocious. That song that you listened to for, I don't know, maybe 2 minutes was so beautiful. It was like a 5-second loop. But the game was a lot about survival. It wasn't so much, is this game going to scare you because the things right now are scary, so much as, is the situation as a whole scary? The premise of the game is you're in a mansion, this ghost kind of traps you in, the front door is like blocked off by like a door cave-in, I guess, front door collapses, can't get out. And you and your team of 5 people have to go about the mansion trying to escape.
Right.
But the only way to heal in the game is to use tonics, and there's a limit in the number of tonics you can have. Likewise, even though you have 5 characters, you are limited to a maximum party size of 3, which means that your team is regularly going to be splitting up and regrouping for different scenarios, and simply because you can't have everyone together at the same time. I don't think it's the greatest horror game that some people make it out to be, but I do think that it's actually a good example of a horror game that isn't a horror game format.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept, to be sure. And it seems to play into what Cookie was talking about with limiting player actions. Because based on what you say, the horror from the game comes entirely from the way that they're preventing you from being able to use traditional JRPG motifs in order to play the game normally. They just limit you further so that you're always just a little bit disadvantaged. And that's where the horror comes from. But does that hold true for all horror games? I mean, I can think of a couple that we were looking through while we were researching this, such as Fatal Frame 2. And while you're this Japanese schoolgirl kind of thing, you get a camera that that you can use to constantly chip away at these beings that should be more powerful than you. And a lot of people still claim that this is one of their favorite horror games.
Well, I do feel that a lot of people make a mistake in assuming that a character has to be powerless. And I think mixing character power and player interactivity or player limitations, a lot of people like to assume that weaker characters that don't control well make for good horror games. And I kind of feel arguably the opposite is true. A good character, like one of the things that makes Alien Isolation scary is the fact that you have really good controls. They work as they're supposed to. Not at all like the Resident Evil games, which are arguably only scary because the slow zombies can get to you because the controls are god-awful. So it kind of feels like there's a built-in handicap that makes situations more threatening. On the other hand, Alien Isolation doesn't have that limitation. Likewise, unlike Amnesia, where your character is defenseless and pretty much has to run away, Alien Isolation gives you guns. You can shoot the androids. I'm pretty sure you can stealth kill the humans. But ultimately, the thing that's supposed to be the horror factor of the game is the alien. Right. And despite all the power you have in the game, the alien is still stronger than you. And I think that lends itself to a lot of horror. There's a lot of, you're really strong, but this thing is still stronger, and you can't beat it. It's a given fact. And that's what makes it so frightening.
And while you're on that topic, it really does seem to be that the primary differentiating mechanic of horror is that the enemy cannot be beaten. You just need to hide from it. You need to survive from it, rather than just flat out destroy it.
Yeah, I think that actually is kind of important, because I feel an enemy that you can beat regularly is not a threat. I mean, like a game where you have nothing but like zombies or silly ghosts that you can just like, I don't want to say point a camera at, because that's, you have to actually conquer your fears and stare at them directly to defeat them. But like in a third person view where you see your character and you just, point your gun and shoot at the opponent and it dies, there's a lot lost there because of the fact that you have a lot of power and your opponents aren't really that threatening, because by like the sixth enemy in, you're just like, oh, it's one of these. I already know how to beat it and I can already deal with it. This thing isn't as big a threat as it was five of these guys ago.
So it doesn't suffer from power creep the way Frieza and Dragon Ball Z.
Like Yu-Gi-Oh!
Yu-Gi-Oh!
Going to try to catch up on some chat here. Darkest Dungeon is a turn-based horror game, though I think one of the big differences between Sweet Home on the NES and Darkest Dungeon is the fact that Sweet Home gives you only 5 characters, whereas Darkest Dungeon you get a bunch of mercenaries. If your characters die in Darkest Dungeon, it's more of a setback. It's an inconvenience. You can just get new characters for free over and over again. And while you will have to rebuild them, it's more just, losing them is just a nuisance. In Sweet Home, if one of those 5 characters dies, they are dead permanently. And so they become a resource that you have to keep and maintain. And if you lose one of these resources, you are set back permanently for the rest of the game. I mean, I think Darkest Dungeon is actually the harder of the 2 games. But I think for the most part, as far as horror games go, they are very, very different games.
Top 30 and Zombies Bow 2, however you say that guy's name, wants us to talk about Slender Man. Do you have anything to say about the Slender Man? Especially the Slender games? Have you even played that?
I have not, but I believe you did, didn't you?
Yes, I did play that game. And like that's another kind of weird one. The backstory behind that one came from a Sherlock Holmes game where they had programmed Watson to follow you. but you could never actually see him walking, and so he would just suddenly show up behind you, and you'd be like, and whoever was somebody was watching that Sherlock Holmes thing and noticed that reaction from the players, and they're like, huh, let's try and do that and turn it into a horror game. And so that mechanic became the basis for the Slender Man game, which, aside from that, is incredibly boring. Like, all you're doing is walking around at a slow pace with a dying flashlight, looking for pieces of paper on the wall and waiting for the Slender Man to get you.
Yeah, isn't there pretty much nothing you can do about it because there's no rhyme or reason to where he is or whatever?
Oh, no, he actually follows kind of a predictable pattern if you can figure it out. I know a lot of people complain about how predictable that game is. But at the same time, the papers do spawn in places that oftentimes just trap you into areas. So that can be a little bit annoying.
Well, I think the predictable pattern thing kind of brings up a thing about the enemy being powerful or non-threatening.
Mm.
Like, once you figure out the Slender Man's power, the game kind of stops being scary because you know where he is. And the game's source of fear in the first place is not knowing where he is.
Exactly. I mean, I could never figure it out, so that game always scared the crap out of me. But yeah, Slender was also interesting just because it was based entirely like Five Nights at Freddy's. They took another game that was trying to accomplish something and failed, and then they said, okay, let's recast this failure into the context of horror. And suddenly that caused it to be a rousing success. A lot of people found this Slender Man game compelling.
Yeah, and I actually know some of the lore behind Five Nights at Freddy's actually makes it compelling, and is why we got a fourth game. And I actually know you wanted to talk about the narrative or background lore of Five Nights at Freddy's.
Mm.
So hit us up.
Well, it's just that the Five Nights at Freddy's video games, they kind of tell their lore in them. They give you some mini games that show you the basics of what could be happening, but they don't like shove it in your face or anything. Most of the lore is left very vague, and much of the appeal of the game for people that have gotten into it. I have a coworker who is super into Five Nights at Freddy's. And for him, so much of it is just like going into the source code of the website to find whatever comment in the HTML that Scott Cawthon has left as a clue for what's coming in the next game. And so much of it is just the meta. Like just trying to search the story and understand the making of the game for any little bit of clue to let you know what's going on when it's just kind of not there.
Would you say that works in the game's favor, or not particularly?
Oh, absolutely. Going off on kind of a tangent here, but I'll bring it back. I'll connect it eventually. One of the fathers of horror, as we understand it right now, is Edgar Allan Poe. You could probably say that he is the father of the horror genre. But he is also credited as being the inventor of the mystery genre. And so that's something that I personally find kind of interesting, because after thinking about that, I've seen that there are a lot of things that the two genres share in common. And nearly every good horror story, at least, has some sort of thing that you just can't figure out, and you have to ascribe it to something supernatural. And Five Nights at Freddy's seems to do this very well by just layering thing after thing after thing that you just can't entirely explain.
Yeah. Well, I had a thought, and then I lost it.
Mm.
Oh. I was actually going to say, there's a reason that mystery and horror seem to go well, hand in hand well together. I mean, case in point, Scooby Doo. It's arguably one of the more iconic cartoon shows, even though it's kind of strange. And go figure, it tries to mix horror with mystery, like in a not so subtle way.
Mm,
Like they try to solve a mystery, and the whole solving the mystery thing is horror. Well, it's a horror story in a kiddie way.
right.
The game Clue arguably also kind of revolves around that idea. More so the movie, where basically they're trying to figure out who the killer is, and the killer could be any of them. So you never know who's going to die or when, but simply the fact that there is someone that they need to figure out who the killer is before they all die.
Mm. And to some respect, that's also the basic plot line of, say, Friday the 13th. They're trying to find out who's this guy that keeps killing them. But the key difference seems to be that the resolution is it's a guy who rose out of a lake.
Hmm? Yeah, but I do think for the most part, a lot of games also actually do bring this mystery element to them, and I think that's one of the main reasons Silent Hill is so big. It's because of the fact that a lot of the game is just trying to figure out why it's so messed up.
Mm.
Like everything's kind of normal, then you've got weird bad guys, and then you've got clearly there's weird bad guys and weird bad things happening for a reason, and so the whole game is about progressing through a narrative where you're trying to figure out what bad things happen to make the bad things that are happening now happen. And I feel like I've brought up Silent Hill a lot, which is ironic because I am not a fan of the games.
Well, it's a big game series. There's definitely got to be something that you can take from it.
I do think also, for the most part, narrative as a whole actually does a lot to really bring out horror.
Mm.
Let's see, would we prefer a scary game or an adventure game? Well, I'm going adventure game, hands down. I'm not much of a scary game kind of guy, as Cookie can attest to.
I love scary games. I wouldn't say that I prefer them over an adventure game, although it depends somewhat which particular one we're talking about. Because there can be some really bad adventure games, and there can also be some very bad scary games.
Yeah.
But man, I would love to play me some... What is that? The Silent Hills thing? The one that Guillermo del Toro was supposedly working on?
The new one who's...
The one that got canceled?
Yeah, I don't remember what it's called. I was gonna say Homecoming, but that one's already released.
Mm.
And I'll beat Alien Isolation at some point, maybe. That or else to clean up 50 gigs. You know, it's a neither or kind of thing.
Mm.
Let's see.
So do you think that a horror game needs to be a horror game to be scary or horror in some way?
I don't think so, because the idea of a horror game is the fact that you've got like messed up Lovecraftian monsters, you've got demons and weird creepy monsters and ghosts and zombies, and I don't think that's necessarily necessary. I mean, I'm just going to throw out Alien Isolation. We've talked a lot about that, and that's not really a horror game, and yet it's terrifying.
Right.
But I want to go focus more on another example, and I'm going to bring out a surprise hitter here and go with Metroid Fusion. Because Metroid games aren't horror games. I mean, you're a woman in a paddle suit that runs around and just destroys planets as a hobby or something. And then you play Metroid Fusion, it's like, well, you're running around, you're destroying everything, you're still an overpowered death machine. And then there's like your original sewer possessed by a parasite, and it's just you, but better, and it's horrifying. And actually, going back to Wizbox's argument about how sound is more important than graphics, the graphics in Fusion kind of okay, clear enough to see what's going on, but nothing impressive. But the sound that happens when the SAX peers into a room, it kind of just goes silent and plays some like heartbeat, footsteps, and maybe like some kind of like, I don't know, it was intimidating music if there was any. But all you know is like it's just walking in slowly, and it's frightening. In a game that's not a horror game.
Going on to this same topic, I absolutely agree with you, by the way. But to me, the perfect example of this was actually Majora's Mask. Because, like, that game is not designed to be a horror game at all. You're not disempowering your character or anything. All it does is it takes that theme and makes it around sadness and death and just dark things, and make sure to keep the character designs as eerie as possible. And it winds up being scary to some extent.
Yeah, I would say that one of the big things is, I mean, one of the things with fear is a sense of hopelessness. And if you feel hopeless, you kind of feel a lot less confident, a lot less afraid, essentially. And well, Majora's Mask isn't really a horror game, and it doesn't necessarily make you feel afraid in the sense that you don't want to progress because it's scary. It does kind of contradict my earlier statement about how the game should do that by basically giving you a sense of dread and hopelessness that you don't often see in a lot of games, especially one that's not really designed to scare you.
You have anything else on that topic?
And I think we both kind of agree on that one and gave some good examples. And that's not to say that being a horror game makes you not scary. I mean, like, Amnesia can be pretty scary. Silent Hill has its moments. Resident Evil has its moments, maybe. And Square Enix's Resident Evil-like game Parasite Eve most certainly had its moments. And they both kind of went that horror route and did it well enough. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're better or worse than games that don't go that route.
Speaking of better or worse, Top 30 in Zombiebo 2 asks, would a haunted house be more scary than a haunted Alcatraz? And I found that kind of to be an interesting question because it's based around the assumption that if a place itself is more threatening, Alcatraz versus a house, that place being more threatening should make the horror of it more threatening. And what do you think? Why wouldn't people go for prisons more often when they're trying to do horror?
And I think I think the question kind of requires some context because it's hard to just take any house and compare it to Alcatraz. I do think prisons have an advantage because they're all about, well, imprisonment. It's in the name. So, well, prison isn't imprisonment, but still. And I mean, something that elicits fear is basically powerlessness, hopelessness, a sense of being dominated. I mean, things that essentially happen in prisons. You lose your freedom. And all the imagery of a prison is basically everything that would essentially bring dread to a person. On the other hand, a house arguably has some more options that can play to its favor. I mean, if you just take any random boring house, then it's like, well, congratulations, you've got like, let's just say a 20-foot by 20-foot house that has a ghost in it. Woo. On the other hand, you got a mansion that just had a lot of crazy stuff go on with the years, and you could get something like The Shining. That is the Jack Nicholson movie, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think that's technically a house, but
You were close to calling him Nicolas Cage, and that would make that movie so much better.
The Shining, starring Nicolas Cage. I've got nothing. I want to see this movie.
Me too.
I don't think it's a good movie, but I'd like to see it. But I mean, I think The Shining kind of showcases what a horror story in a house could be, since I think it plays to its more casual, safe theme pretty well, because it lures you into a sense of safety and security, and then throws that out the window.
Mm.
Especially when your boyfriend/husband kind of goes insane and tries to kill you with an axe.
If I may interject here, while you were talking, I was trying to think along the same things, and part of the thing about the Shining, it's a father going insane and then destroying his family for the most part, right?
That's about what it is.
I mean, there's some ghosts, and the kid has psychic powers, but it's mostly just dad kills family.
I think he tries. I think they get away.
Yeah, they get away. But I mean, like, that's the threat. You got an axe-wielding dad. And part of the thing that makes that scary, I believe, is that it's infectious. Something that seems to play well in horror is if you can actually believe, either even just make believe or wanting to believe, the idea that it's believable that it could happen to you does make it a bit more scary. And so, given that, I think that most people are going to find that the haunted house is scarier than Alcatraz, just simply because they've been to a house like that.
Yeah, I don't think we've really been to a prison. I mean, technically there was that one we went to, but not quite the same. But and I think for the most part, going off on how the haunted house is scary because it can, if it can relate to you, it also, like The Shining in particular, it's like, well, it's a story about a dad who goes crazy. It's like, well, dads are, especially in fiction, kind of represent, well, parents in general represent security and safety. And when one of your safety nets ends up trying to kill you, that's a pretty good reason to get scared.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of relations, I actually kind of want to talk about another relationship. The relationship between the character and the player. And I think this is going to be an interesting topic because there's a very unique relationship there. And I think, for the most part, a lot of horror really will revolve around basically the relationship between the story, the character, and the player. And this love triangle can really make or break a horror game, I think. And I think a good example of it is Silent Hill. I've been talking so much about how it does things well. I'm actually going to talk about how I feel it does things a little wrong. Because one of the things with Silent Hill is the fact that a lot of it boils down to characters in the story being punished for things they do. Silent Hill 2, there's a lot about how the main character apparently had some sexual frustration because his wife became really sick, and so he was off on his own for a while. And then eventually he kills his wife by smothering her in her hospital bed with a pillow. And then he ends up going to Silent Hill because he's getting letters from someone that's apparently his wife, but not really. And then the game starts. And I think one of the big drawbacks of that whole system is the fact that if I went into a game like that, I'd be like, well, there's a lot of imagery that's designed to kind of scare you based on the crime that your character committed. But especially not being a married man, I've never actually killed my wife. So any imagery revolved around killing a loved one is a little lost on me because I just don't relate to it.
Mm.
And so punishing the character for something they did doesn't quite have an impact on me as a player.
But you can imagine any other of your loved ones being destroyed, right?
I think you could, but a lot of it's a targeted fear and a targeted punishment, and it's kind of misses. It's kind of off target with me. I mean, compare that to, let's go with Parasite Eve. While Aya Brea does have things that relate, or there's things specific to her in the story, she's pretty much a cop that's stuck going into crazy situations where she has to kill mutant animals or whatever. Now, admittedly, I've never actually fought mutant animals before or been part of the police or had crazy metabolic powers that give me magic. But at the same time, I mean, everybody's been in situations they're not used to before. And Aya Brea is generally not. Aya Brea doesn't actually start the game having, dealt with this before. Not having. She doesn't have a whole lot of experience with it. Like in the first game, everything is new to her. So there's kind of a relationship between the character and Aya Brea. Oh, sorry, the player and Aya Brea, in that you're both essentially experiencing things for the first time. And in the second game, if you played the first game already, you both already have the same experiences. But of course, they kind of turned that on it. They slightly turned that on its head by changing the experience a bit and making the enemies more threatening and whatnot. And so I think for the most part, while Silent Hill kind of just sort of has a bit of a disconnect between the character and the player by targeting the character and not quite targeting the player, the horror in Parasite Eve is basically targeting both of you at the same time and at the same way.
Mm. Regarding player narrative relationships, it's the thing that I wind up thinking about when you're talking about that is just how exactly is the player related to the character, because there's still some debate about that. So do you think that relationship plays at all into what you're talking about?
I would say so. And I think there's a trifecta of how you need to balance that to really get a good horror game. Because I feel a narrative that targets the character more than the player probably might kind of just sort of miss the perfect mark. It might just sort of detach the player from the story and kind of miss, some of the things that are supposed to be scary.
But ideally, when people are talking about, say, driving a car, for example, they don't say, I turned the steering wheel to go right. They say, I went right. So, in a way, we sort of project ourselves into our tools. So, shouldn't that mean that that targeting the character should, in a way, feel like targeting yourself?
I would say, if done right, then it should.
Mm. So what kinds of things would you say then interrupt that communication?
I think it better, or something to point out, is how it works a little better. It's like I talked about how in Silent Hill, it targets the character for crimes that he committed that the player necessarily didn't commit, because most of them probably don't kill their loved ones on a regular basis.
That's fair.
But I mean, bringing up Alien Isolation once again, for the most part, the plot of the game is basically Ellen Ripley's daughter is trying to go to the space station to get the black box from. I wish I remember the name of the ship from the first Alien movie. But she basically wants that black box to find out what happened to her mother. Things seem pretty normal until you try to get on the space station and everything goes downhill really fast. And so at that point, you pretty much want to get off the space station. Both of you do. Your character wants to actually find out what happened to her mother. And there's actually a point pretty early in the game where you find like the recorder or the flight box, and you find out that it's empty and it doesn't tell you anything. Your character kind of breaks down and like starts crying because she's no closer than she already was, especially concerning all pain and all the effort she had to go through to get there. As a player, you kind of sympathize because you've been through a lot. You're hanging out with this pretty cool dude who wasn't trying to kill you, and then you saw the alien kill him with his tail. I want to say at that point you've also seen the alien firsthand, and if you actually managed to sneak past humans earlier, you got to see the alien murder them all. So you got to see the threat. You got to see how much it's going to suck to continue in this game. The player at that point probably wants to get off the space station. So anything that basically makes it harder for you to get off the space station is not only something that, impacts her, it impacts you. She doesn't learn about her mother, you can't get off the space station.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's like a good combo target. Sure, you could argue most people don't have to deal with trying to find clues about where their parents are or whatever, and they don't have to go through like giant death trap space stations to find people. But the reasons she's feeling miserable have an impact on why you are feeling miserable.
Right. So there is that player connection just by the fact that while you as a player are goal oriented and the character has some other goals, they contextualize it so that the goals that you have line up with the goals the character has. That's what you're saying.
Yep. Because, the sooner you find out, arguably if you find out about Ellen Ripley, if you find out about her fate sooner, that's one step towards getting off that space station, which is one step closer towards ending the game and not being scared anymore, which is a good goal.
Or you could just turn it off like a coward.
Yeah, there's that too. And I think for the most part, Sweet Home actually kind of accomplishes that too. Every time you make progress in that game, you're steps closer towards, getting out of the mansion. So, and of course, the game also actually rewards you for one of its mechanics. Because part of the plot of the game is everybody's going to this mansion to try to take pictures of these paintings that this one guy made before he disappeared. And so throughout the game, you want to take pictures of these paintings. But when you do, you actually get hints to to actually getting through the game and essentially solving puzzles. So going through to take pictures of paintings to solve their original goal helps you solve your goal of getting out of the mansion and ending the game. So I do think it's kind of important to make sure that the character's goals and the player's goals aren't necessarily identical, but at least match up.
Right.
What the character wants is what the player wants. And when the character is set back, the player is set back too.
Right. That definitely makes sense. That aligns a lot more with traditional game design theory, which seems, to me at least, a little like an exception to the way that horror is usually designed, since games in other genres tend to try to make your character more powerful and consistently improving as you go along, so that you can just execute more and more powerful attacks. Whereas in a horror game, you're just disempowered even more as it goes on, until you finally reach that one point of euphoria where you're actually safe. But in this way, the two different types of game design line up.
Sorry, I was actually reading through the topics to see where we're going after this. We're so good at this.
I know, right? We've actually been going for close to an hour.
Yeah, which is actually a lot longer than I thought we'd go on. At the same time, though, we haven't had anyone talk in nearly 20 minutes.
Yeah, what a bunch of deadbeats. I'm joking, guys. I love you.
Let's see. Yeah, we really went out of these topics out of order, which kind of actually is throwing me off right now.
Well, why don't we just say that that's enough for now?
Well, I do like this one topic that we actually didn't touch on that I think it would be an amusing closer before we actually get to questions.
All right.
I'm going to read the topic word for word. Personalities like Markiplier, PewDiePie, and others have used horror games, especially, to leverage themselves to fame. Does that level of abstraction maintain the game's horror or transform it into a different genre, like comedy? If it's like comedy, who does such a dark and opposite genre serve so popularly in the guise of comedy?
Right. I remember that. Just the idea is that these YouTube personalities, they so often go through horror games, but their personalities that they project inside of YouTube is that of a clown. Like, it seems like so much of the appeal is just that they're like sitting in that office, and then all of a sudden, here comes Golden Freddy. He makes a scary thing, and then as clowns, these guys seriously exaggerate their reactions. Like, you'll have Markiplier, like all the arm movement and everything. It's like you can tell that this is a comedic act, and yet they're drawing from the source of horror for that.
Well,
And so it just seems like a weird juxtaposition to stick horror and comedy together like that.
I'm just going to read what Blitz says because I think that just summarizes anything I could say way better than I could say it. Comedy is when something tragic happens to someone else. Classic weird. And I think that's a lot to it. I mean, slapstick comedy. And I think in a lot of ways, for the most part, overreaction and reaction and horror do kind of mix well together. Because for the most part, a lot of people generally... I think one of the big things with horror games in general is the fact that people like to play them as sort of a way to prove their courage or their bravery. And of course, seeing someone just freak out over a scare is kind of funny because they kind of betrayed that courage or bravery.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, when you're watching someone else, you don't feel anywhere near as afraid because it happens to them, not to you. So, there's kind of that nice disconnect that actually works in the viewer's favor because they get to laugh at someone else for being scared, even though there's a good chance they would have been scared themselves.
Mm. Definitely. Like, a lot of the games that they're playing are legitimately scary. Let's see, where was I going with this? Lit Wizpork says that comedy is when something tragic happens to somebody else. I think you already read that?
Yeah.
Okay. But like that seems to be a bit oversimplifying because, like, I can watch Oedipus Rex and see the guy gouge his eyes out, and it's not funny. So it's not simply just tragedy happening to somebody else. But
I think the thing with YouTube horror reactions is the fact that it's harmless tragedy. I mean, at the end of the day, Markiplier freaked out, raised his voice, threw his arms around, and was like, "Oh my god!" At the end of the day, the most pain that anyone suffered was maybe Markiplier's like heart rate went up a little bit, and then maybe your ears hurt because you were silly and put the volume really loud on a Markiplier video. But all in all, it's pretty harmless. Someone gouging out their eyeballs, not so much.
yeah, but you're still seeing some horrifying imagery contrasted against Markiplier doing this.
I think it's because ultimately when you watch Markiplier, you watch it more for him and his reactions. The game gives context to the comedy. Like, Markiplier on his own would be kind of weird, because I'm sure I've looked absolutely silly just flapping my arms around going, "Oh my god." But I'm sure if you actually just put a horror game instead of your face, I guess your face and a horror game have a lot in common. But pish. But
Oh.
I'm kidding.
I know.
But yeah, I am pretty sure if we had a horror game playing and me freaking out to it, it'd be a lot more interesting to watch me flail my arms around than it would be me flailing my arms around while talking to you about how Markiplier is funny when he does it.
Yeah, it just seemed interesting to me that when you introduce that extra layer of abstraction, the genre of what you're viewing becomes so incredibly different. Like, it also seems interesting from a legal sense because there is some ambiguity to whether or not doing Let's Plays and broadcasting on Twitch when you're not doing a game show like us. Like, where was I going with this?
Legalities, ambiguity.
Right. Part of the way that these things are claimed to be legal is through fair use. And the argument that you're required to make when claiming something is fair use is that what you're making is significantly different than the product that you're reproducing. And so, in that way, the fact that it does become so different, that it does transform from a horror into a comedy, it's, I don't know, it just seems like something foundationally important.
Yeah. All I can say to that is, I think we found next time's topic.
Oh, yes!
Accidental topic.
I was hoping you would go for that. So next time we're going to be talking about YouTube, Twitch, all of these kinds of game broadcasting things and the way that this has shaped how the gaming landscape has transformed. Right? Am I getting this right?
That sounds pretty legit.
Okay.
So, right, and I think with that, I think we've actually gotten to a good closing point. Let's go to questions and answers. Let's see if our two active people actually have any questions, or if they've all abandoned us because we're far too boring.
I'm checking the viewer list. 2 of them are us. And yeah. I don't think that anybody is actually still actively participating. But in case I'm wrong, thank you guys for watching. Yeah, sorry. We just had to put you guys on the spot. We wanted to make sure that you feel included and loved, you jerks.
Huh. Really, Cookie? Apparently, according to Cookie, the stream drops for him, which is kind of disappointing.
Yeah.
And I do think for the most part, yeah, actually, quality might be too high. We'll have to talk about that off camera.
Okay. We'll talk about that off camera.
I do think for the most part, I think we covered a lot with this topic, and there was probably a lot less to really talk about compared to the last topic. I don't know.
Cookie says, I will fight you IRL.
I will fight you harder.
It's funny because you could actually do that.
Actually, I can't anymore.
All right. Well, thank you all for watching. It was good participating with you. You guys had some good questions that really helped propel this thing forward, and we definitely appreciate that.
And actually, I remember there was a question that a guy who left earlier asked, and I thought it was kind of a funny question. If you made a scary game, what would you call it? When we throw this on YouTube, I feel everybody should just, comment on what they would call their game and what it would be about. I think I would call my horror game the day Prussia eats the big blue blob and the rest of Europe cries in a corner.
If I may do a bit of a less humorous answer, I actually have an idea for a game. I'd probably call it something like the Demon Beyond. But it's just like drawing a lot from Sweet Home.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
I think finding a name for a game would be pretty hard without having some sort of thing to go with. And I don't feel like spending another half an hour talking about what kind of horror I'd make just so I can come up with a name for it.
Fair enough.
That or I'd call my game Alien Isolation and just, make it like a 2-second like flash movie that I saw on Steam for like $20, and then everybody upvotes it because they're upvoting the wrong game. But no.
Wizbork says, I wish I would have been here for the VR AR one. Sad face.
Yeah, I don't blame you. I think we carried that one out a lot better overall.
If I may put a plug in here, we created a Twitter account specifically for this channel, @BoredAndSimple, and we also have a hashtag, #BoredAndSimple. If you tweet either using that hashtag or to our Twitter account, we are reading this very regularly, and even if you have comments about the last episode or any previous episode that we did, you can still get prompt a discussion in one of our episodes. So please follow us on Twitter and start tweeting at us. And who knows, you may wind up on the show.
Okay. Also, I'd like to say, if you're watching this on YouTube, I seriously do say, feel free to comment anything down below. And if you have a video game title that you would actually be interested, or if you just have an interesting horror game, video game title, put it down there and just, say what the title is, give like a brief description of what it would be. Don't make it 10 paragraphs. That's not brief. Just have fun with it.
All right. And with that, we will see you guys in the next one.
Everyone have a good day.
Bye.